Welcome to the Antedote, where we're turning the tables on your media landscape. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Roth Cushell.
And we're not going to talk much about it, but I guess we would be remiss if we did not mention the death of Senator John McCain and the very just very unsettling, troubling to say the least, narratives that are out there and the media that are out there and social media of the great heroic John McCain. And I noticed it's not just coming from like the usual suspects within like the two-party system and just the usual media, the usual liars in the so-called mainstream media. It's even coming from ostensibly candidates and political figures that are supposed to be outside of this this neoliberal two-party consensus, and that being most, I think, exemplified in one Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, the aspiring soon-to-be congresswoman from New York, who tweeted out this very it was very trouble. It was very hard to very troubling, very I would say. Less than it doesn't do much to really get you excited about the prospects of someone like this being in Congress if she's already paying her respects to John McCain and portraying him as this great hero and example of what America is supposed to be. So I know you sent this my way, and I know you had similar sentiments when you saw this from her. And I was honestly, maybe I'm just naive, but I was expecting a little better out of her.
It shows sort of where that's headed, and everybody understands you play a game in politics, but you don't have to play a game in politics. If you're against warmongering and if you're against the military-industrial complex as a way of driving an economy based on death and destruction, which she says that she is, Ocasio-Cortez, and which Bernie Sanders, to a much lesser extent, sort of implies that he is, even though he was known as the senator from Boeing or Lockheed, I forget when, in terms of some of the contracts that he delivered in relationship to Vermont. And so there's a sense that, no, you don't have to do politics where you just sort of praise the grand civility and great-hearted heroicness of someone like John McCain. And though I also am not interested in the Caitlin Johnstone approach, maybe of the anticipation or the celebration of a death and getting kicked off Twitter for 24 hours and becoming a cause célèbre as a martyr of progressive speech, I think that we do need to be plain spoken in relationship to this moment and the background of one John McCain, and yet not get caught up in it from the whole thing of it being portrayed by elements of the so-called resistance, and that how civil and how big-hearted he was as a politician when a woman said, I can't trust Obama, he's an Arab, and McCain says, no, he's not an Arab, he's a good family man, and that somehow is seen as in McCain's favor, when it actually shows that McCain and that campaign that he then took on Sarah Palin, of course, Bannon and that whole crew is in the background in many ways. That was that led into the Trump campaign in many ways, and it was just an ongoing rhetorical warfare against large swaths of the human population, which included all of the warmongering that John McCain did over his lifetime, never seeing a war that he didn't like. And so I guess hashtagged just another treasonous war criminal, and maybe not quite as wicked as Netanyahu, but very likely more wicked than Putin.
Yeah, that's a great analysis, and we're going to leave the legacy of John McCain to other people to discuss. I know there's other people out there that are doing a great job of really speaking a lot of truth when it comes to McCain and what his legacy represented, which is needed. I mean, I realize the whole idea of don't speak ill of the dead, but, we need to be honest, though. And I mean, someone like John McCain, I'm sorry, is not to be celebrated in any way, shape, or form, and we should absolutely be unequivocally condemning this man and everything that he stood for and everything that he advocated for, because in just condemning it without any type of reservations or without any type of second thoughts whatsoever. And that's the problem. And I think, Cortez, if we're already seeing this from her, then, I can just say I hope her reaction to the impending inevitable death of George Herbert Walker Bush is better than her reaction to this one. Although, I won't hold my breath waiting for that. But on that note,
Greg, I will admit that I am into nuance and not condemning people without reservation, without considering the totality, while also being plain spoken about the the wicked aspects. And I can understand people in the age of Trump, where we will address during the show the potentiality that the 11/9 Trump, Israel, Netanyahu, Russia, Putin, City of London, Russian Jewish mob operation backed up by the large portions of the GOP Breitbart new establishment was a continuity of the 9/11 operation. And we will deal with that. And so that has to be dealt with. So I understand that if you see it like that and you see this sort of Trump assault going on, that someone like John McCain, who steps in to put his foot down in certain areas, whether it's around aspects of healthcare that could have, impacts on people's lives potentially in a very milquetoast way, in the way that McCain did it, or things like potentially upholding little basic crumbs in relationship to a constitutional republic that's way far gone for decades and decades and decades, when you have basically the president shot in the head 50 years ago by elements that included aspects of hostile foreign power, and somehow we're talking about saving the republic, and John McCain is a hero of saving the republic in the day and age of Trump in the 21st century. Yeah, not so much.
Good points, and I do agree with the need for nuance. But just in general, I mean, I think that there needs to be at least a line drawn where you just I think just generic celebrating, especially from people who proclaim themselves as being opposed to all these foreign wars and all this criminality that's been carried out in the name of the American people by this government for so long. I think that just out and out praising of someone like McCain, who has the obvious record that he did and was one of the more notorious figures within our political system in terms of advocating for some of the worst policies that have been put in place, military related, I think it is troubling. So as I said, we'll leave the legacy of John McCain for other people to discuss, and that includes people that we're going to be getting into on this show today. And I guess I'll preface what we're going to get into by the show today is going to be the first of a few that I think we're going to do over the next few weeks. It's going to be focusing on on September 11th and the upcoming 17th anniversary, which of course is taking place in actually just over 2 weeks from now. And
by the way, Greg, maybe we should just step back and trust the plan, because QAnon proponent Zional is taking pictures with Trump in the Oval Office, and don't worry, he'll be also at the 9/11 Truth Conference upcoming, where Cynthia McKinney will be. So I'm sure he will once again tell us that we shouldn't focus on who did 9/11 and why. So trust the plan.
Yes, Zional, the used car salesman who I would trust about as far as I could throw him across the room. And you're right, though. Maybe we should just trust the plan. But in regards to that, as it relates to September 11th, honestly, I think that, it's our duty if other people aren't going to step in to give a little bit more of a critical analysis than someone like Lionel, Mr. QAnon, Mr. Drain the Swamp will give of a lot of these realities it appears behind September 11th. So for the next few weeks, we're going to be focusing on this event and kind of looking at it both with the benefit of hindsight, but also looking at current events 17 years later and how they figure into where we believe the investigation into an event or not so much even the investigation, but where the focus for people who are serious, I think, into trying to figure out exactly what happened on September 11th, exactly how it is continued to affect our system both domestically as well as globally with the continuing on a terrorist operation known as the War on Terror here in the West. And so this show here, I think we're just going to try to put a kind of put a narrative together here within the next few weeks. And we're going to start today. And one of the events that I think really figures into kind of looking at September 11th and where we're at now is this so-called Russiagate narrative. And I think via this Russiagate narrative, actually, I think we have a perspective on things that we may not have had just a couple of years ago. And I think that's largely ironically due to the presidency of Donald Trump, who, when you really start to look into this Russiagate connection, you will find that all sorts of these, Zionist, Soviet, Israeli, Jewish mob figures. You'll also find a lot of figures that are very prominent in the economic community, financial community of New York City, where Donald Trump built his empire for so long. And you'll find people that are directly involved with Donald Trump's presidency, such as Louis Eisenberg. And you'll also find people like Ronald Lauder, who has been one of Donald Trump's oldest and closest friends, the head of the World Jewish Congress, who was involved in the New York, New Jersey Port Authority in the lead up to September 11th, and Larry Silverstein getting control of the property. And I think you find some pieces begin to come together with regards to what appears to be not just the Alex Jones angle on 9/11, that it was all the Saudis and that it was Robert Mueller covering it up. When you actually look at the actual operation, what may or may not have happened, which led to the actual destruction of the World Trade Center towers, and who and what interest it was done on behalf of. And I think a look at someone like Donald Trump's background actually gives a pretty good, to a large extent, a pretty good idea of where this all leads, I think, and not just in the event of September 11th itself, but in current ongoing events right now in the age of Donald Trump. And I know you're going to talk about September 11th as it relates to the events of 11/9, as you call it, the significance of the 2016 election, and whether or not this was actually a continuation of the 9/11 operation. I know you've got some clips ready to play of Jimmy Dore discussing in a rather very less satisfactory manner the whole Russiagate narrative and the whole idea of quote unquote Russian collusion and the possible ramifications of it. But Jeremy, do you have anything you wanted to add to that before we get into some of these clips and talking about some of these people?
Well, I appreciate that breakdown, and I do think that, yes, I want to architect a little bit in pushing towards some of our next week's, following week's ongoing coverage of September 11th and unpacking that in a way where we can sort of create maybe a framework. And in terms of September 11th, I'll get into this more later, but I would put it into a three-part framework where you have an intelligence operation, which is basically the framing of the false story, the patsy operation, the planes into building hijackers from the hills, directed from the hills of Afghanistan, and we missed it. That's an intelligence operation. Then you also have a military operation, which is the physicality, what actually happened, buildings coming down, blowing up, projectiles hitting buildings, whatever sort, however that worked. These types of actual physical military scenarios. And then additionally, you have a counterintelligence operation that I would say is ongoing that can be seen in relationship to what you pointed out in terms of this Trump network and this ongoing Trump operation, and how tightly it is connected to some of the actual potential people involved in real estate around September 11th. But then when you also then flip it as thinking about counterintelligence as a way of confusing people in terms of maybe proactive counterintelligence. In many ways, I would say what we work to do here is actually defensive counterintelligence, open source on behalf of we the people worldwide, but also anchored here in the United States of America by using open source material and attempt to try to parse through the weaponized discourse that's continually heading our way to sort of either force us into dead ends or weaponize the dialectics, these types of things. But you also have this forceful counterintelligence operation that's part of the ongoing cover-up of September 11th. 11th that pervades the entirety of the political spectrum. And then this last thing is that this idea that Donald Trump was brought forth and proposed to, especially to this InfoWars crowd, especially the people who should have known better in relationship to seeing where Alex Jones has devolved on 9/11 towards what you mentioned, towards Saudis and Soros or whatever Alex Jones's actual take is now on 9/11. That Donald Trump was the guy who was going to tell us who knocked down the towers. And yet he has this tight relationship with the people who were involved in the 9/11 real estate deals, as you pointed out. So this is the level that the 11/9 operation, and representing the Trump operation, and it's a long-term operation, as we'll see, is representative of the continuity of the 9/11 operation, and in many ways not only takes advantage but expands the working of the counterintelligence operation that's part of the September 11 cover-up. And we can see, I think, that working by analyzing certain networks across the political spectrum that are somehow missing the very obvious open aspects that point to this collusion conspiracy that, yes, involves Russia in a very direct way, but also then ultimately ties back on through parts of Europe and back into Israel, and then ultimately back into Manhattan. So that's my take on that. And I would just point out in terms of Jimmy Dore that he, in terms of like things like we brought up before around people like Ocasio-Cortez or people like Bernie Sanders, he's been a very critical, and he speaks very plainly in relationship to the war celebration, the coziness of those types with the Democratic corporatists. Bernie Sanders was sort of flipping around in terms of his coziness with the Democratic Party now. Ocasio-Cortez celebrating John McCain, all of this. So he's right on target around that, which makes it even more stunning in a way that he somehow is missing this open, and we'll point out later, he also is very critical of Israel, Netanyahu, and somehow he cannot take his audience to the place of actually analyzing the open source facts around what Russiagate, in its ongoing, unfolding fashion in the public sphere in relationship to courtrooms, actually is. So I'm going to play this clip. It's from maybe more than 6 months ago. It's Jimmy Dore on his show actually doing an analysis of an interview by Aaron Mate on the Real News Network of the author of the book Collusion, Luke Harding, and we actually responded to this very same interview in relationship to Caitlin Johnstone's take on it in a previous Antedote that I believe was called "The Danger of Not Addressing Russiagate" or something like that. Is that right, Greg?
I think that's the title. Very, very close to the actual title.
Okay, so I'm going to play some of this clip here, and just to sort of draw out how this is operating, and then we'll delve a little more deeply into it. So here we go.
That because that's also an assertion of the infamous Steele dossier, that there is a transactional relationship between Trump and the Kremlin, and that Putin has been cultivating Trump for several years now. But explain why you think that is, and why you think there's evidence of a transactional relationship.
Well, I think you just have to kind of look at what's happened. We had Donald Trump's trip back in the kind of late Cold War period, and I talked to a whole number of sources for this book, some in Moscow, some in London, some in Washington, some defectors. I met with Chris Steele, the author of the dossier, as well.
He met with Chris Steele, the author of the dossier, which sounds impressive until you realize Chris Steele didn't fucking meet with anybody who he talked to write the dossier. And he paid people to tell him stories. And that's all the dossier was. That's literally what it was. A guy, Chris, he had money to throw around. He called people he knew 15 years earlier in Russia. He doesn't even speak Russian. He calls them, says, I got some money if you have some stories on Trump. They're like, oh, we got stories. You got money? We got stories. So he says, I've talked to Chris Steele, who didn't meet with anybody. All right, here we go. Did you want to say?
No.
I mean, that's a pretty disingenuous way to actually talk about it. I mean, this was the head of the MI6 desk for Russia, I believe, and to sort of paint that as if he is just necessarily in this dossier, just paying people for stories and making it all up. Maybe that's the case. You actually read it, and the dossier, go read back through it. It looks like exactly what it's said to be, a raw intelligence document. In even developed intelligence documents, if someone's batting above 70%, 80%, something like that, that's considered very, very good intelligence. This is a raw intelligence document that looks like it's heading towards that realm of, 3/4 of it is very likely correct. And there certain key pieces that are wrong, possibly. But the overall scheme of it looks like it's not just Steele paying people to tell him stories, and that he doesn't know anybody. No, he was the guy who headed the MI6 Russia desk, so he has some contacts that might be able to tell him certain things. Now, if you want to question about the motives of why MI6 might be, an ex-MI6 operative officer might be doing this, and then also relate it back to things like his company's relationship in the past with Oleg Deripaska, who is a key Russian Jewish industrialist involved in all of this, apparently. Or if you want to connect it to the Paul Singer and the Republican origins of paying for the dossier, or then how it then connected to the Clinton the campaign, and then they took over the dossier payments, then that's another thing. But then to just sort of dismiss it out of hand as this is a guy who doesn't speak Russian and doesn't have any he didn't actually talk to anybody, I don't know about that. I think people should go actually read the Jane Mayer article that did a deeper dive into Steele's background.
And I think what you have to understand is the fact that the sort of Soviet state and its Russian successor is very keen on kind of cultivating people, particularly Americans. And bringing Trump over for this kind of trip was pretty unusual. It was what's known in the intelligence trade as a kind of classic cultivation operation. And we know from leaked KGB memos the kind of person they were looking for during this period was...
First of all, how could it be unusual that they brought him over if it's a classic operation? So that's a contradiction, right? Am I out of my mind? He goes, so it was unusual that they brought him over to do this thing. That's classic what they do. What?
You're not out of your mind, Jimmy. You're just being disingenuous because, yes, it's a classic intelligence operation. What percentage of we the people have been brought over to Moscow on a paid trip, or to go check it out at the height of the Cold War? Yeah, no one I know, I don't think. So, I mean, so that's just being disingenuous in a way. It's for it to be it's a classic operation, intelligence operation, and it's also not every single person in the United States of America has been cultivated in such a manner as Donald Trump obviously has been way back. So I'm just going to finish this off right now.
He just did that, right?
Yeah, I did.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Someone who was vain, narcissistic, interested in money, perhaps unfaithful in their marriage. And basically Donald Trump kind of ticks every single box. And when I was researching this, I tracked down the daughters of the Soviet ambassador at the time, who went up to Trump Tower, flattered Trump and said, "You've built the most wonderful building in America." And so it goes on. And I think it's gone through phases.
What?
What's going on?
What the fuck was that? There was some girls who went to Trump Tower to tell him he built a great building, and so collusion. What?
Yes, and then there was that guy that he talked to that didn't actually talk to anybody.
That actually talked to
anybody.
too. There's that guy.
Okay, yeah. He says some girls who went to Trump Tower. Yeah, not exactly. I mean, I agree that Luke Harding does not make a very good verbal case for all that's actually his research in his book actually represents. And I would also then say, too, is that pretty much like everybody else, he does not deal with the actual totality of this operation, especially in how tightly this long-term operation relates to Israel and mob activities and shadow government activities in the United States of America for a long time, too. But just to sort of fill out the way that someone who is actually trying to get to the bottom of this story might do, I'm actually going to read from Collusion, Luke Harding's book, where it actually describes what Jimmy Dore just dismissed as some girls complimenting Donald Trump. Okay, so I'm going to read from page 220. The KGB wouldn't invite someone to Moscow out of altruism. Dignitaries flown to the USSR on expenses-paid trips were typically left-leaning writers or cultural figures. The state would expend hard currency. The visitor would say some nice things about Soviet life. The press would report these remarks, seeing in them a stamp of approval. Despite Gorbachev's policy of engagement, he was still a Soviet leader. The KGB continued to view the West with deep suspicion. It carried on with efforts to subvert Western institutions and acquire secret sources, with NATO its number one strategic intelligence target. Nor did the KGB foresee imminent political upheaval. Its officers assumed the USSR would go on for a long time. Meanwhile, the Soviet war in Afghanistan ground on. At this point, it is unclear how the KGB regarded Trump. To become a full KGB agent, a foreigner had to agree to two things. A, quote, agent in a Russian or British context was a secret intelligence source. One was, quote, conspiratorial collaboration, unquote. The other was willingness to take KGB instruction. According to Andrew and Gordievsky's book, Comrade Kryotchkov's Instructions, targets who failed to meet these criteria were classified as, quote, confidential contacts, unquote. The Russian word was doveritelnaya shvyaz. The aspiration was to turn trusted contacts into full-blown agents, an upper rung of the ladder. As Kryotchov explained, KGB residents were urged to abandon, quote, stereotyped methods, unquote, of recruitment and use more flexible strategies, if necessary, getting their wives or other family members to help. As Trump tells it, the idea for his first trip to Moscow came after he found himself seated next to the Soviet ambassador Yuri Dubinin. This was in autumn 1986. The event was a luncheon held by Leonard Lauder, the businessman son of Estee Lauder. Dubinin's daughter Natalia, quote, had read about Trump Tower
I believe
and knew
Leonard
all
is
about
the
it.
brother of Ronald Lauder, the head of the World Jewish Congress, who's one of Trump's oldest and closest friends. So.
Yes, and I think we covered some of this also in the when we covered the real Trump dossier and Trump is the Swamp, that show. I think we covered this aspect of it. And so isn't that interesting? This is also a piece that had been covered earlier by Jimmy Dore about this trip to Moscow. And yet here we see Lauder is the one who held the luncheon where then Trump sat next to the Soviet ambassador Yuri Dubinin. And so this is this then, of course, ties right back into the September 11th networks. This is very interesting material on the background of the specific networks who brought Trump into this fold, I would say. So
yeah, good.
Dubinin's daughter Natalia, quote, had read about Trump Tower and knew all about it, unquote, Trump said in his 1987 bestseller, The Art of the Deal. Trump continued, quote, one thing led to another, and now I'm talking about building a large luxury hotel across the street from the Kremlin in partnership with the Soviet government, unquote. Trump's chatty version of events is incomplete. According to Natalia Dubinina, and this is who Dore is referring to as some girl, you know. According to Natalia Dubinina, this is the daughter of a key Soviet ambassador. The actual story involved a more determined effort by the Soviet government to seek out Trump. In February 1985, Kryotchkov complained again about, quote, the lack of appreciable results of recruitment against the Americans in most residencies, unquote. The ambassador arrived in New York in March 1986. His original job was Soviet ambassador to the UN. Dubinina was already living in the city with her family, and she was part of the Soviet UN delegation. Dubinin wouldn't have answered to the KGB, and his role wasn't formally an intelligence one, but he would have had close contacts with the power apparatus in Moscow. He enjoyed greater trust than other lesser ambassadors. Dubinina said she picked up her father at the airport. It was his first time in New York City. She took him on a tour. The first building they saw was Trump Tower on Fifth Avenue. She told Komsomolskaya Pravda newspaper. And Dubinin was so excited he decided to go inside to meet the building's owner. They got into the elevator. At the top, Dubinina said they met Trump. The ambassador, quote, fluent in English and a brilliant master of negotiations, unquote, charmed the busy Trump, telling him, quote, the first thing I saw in the city is your tower, unquote. Dubinina said, quote, Trump melted at once. He is an emotional person, somewhat impulsive. He needs recognition. And of course, when he gets it, he likes it. My father's visit worked on him. Trump like honey to a bee, unquote. This encounter happened 6 months before the Estee Lauder lunch. In Dubinina's account, she admits her father was trying to hook Trump. The man from Moscow wasn't a wide-eyed rube, but a veteran diplomat who served in France and Spain and translated for Nikita Khrushchev when he met with Charles de Gaulle at the Élysée Palace in Paris. He had seen plenty of impressive buildings. Weeks after his first Trump meeting, Dubinin was named Soviet ambassador to Washington. And then last one here. Dubinina's own role is interesting. According to the Matrokhin archive, the Soviet mission to the UN was a haven for the KGB and GRU. Many of the 300 Soviet nationals employed at the UN Secretariat were Soviet intelligence officers working undercover, including as personal assistants to secretary generals. The Soviet UN delegation had greater success in finding agents and gaining political intelligence than the KGB's New York residency. So I just want to point out that there's part of the problem here is the way that the so-called Russiagate reality is being put forth, including by people like Dorr, but this entire network that is in many ways a horseshoe. There's two sides of the horseshoe, I would say. There's one side of the horseshoe represents the connection between this aspects of what we call the alt-left, whether it's this sort of Real News Network crew or Caitlin Johnstone or Jimmy Dore or the Martins or Max Blumenthal. And then the other side then connects into the sort of pro-Trump part that sort of can see no Russiagate evil, that includes InfoWars, the whole Breitbart scenario, alt-right, alt-light, all of that. And then on the other side of the horseshoe, let's say, would be these resistance people who can only see Russia and who will celebrate John McCain as a great statesman because he's against Trump, a great man, a great warrior of peace, just because he's against Trump. And somehow they will not connect the entire story here, which is very much about Israel also, and also about the U.S. And so I'll just introduce a framework to understand this. There's, again, a three-part framework to understanding, quote-unquote, Russiagate. One is the influence operations, long-term influence operations in terms of the cultivation of these specific individuals who are at the highest levels of this campaign in the U.S. government, including people like Trump, Manafort, people like Cohen. I mean, this is go read the dossier again and see some of these names. Then there's this idea about the consciousness operations, psychological warfare, information warfare, con ops, as I might term it, coming out of Israel. And this is very, whereas the sort of influence operations seem to have an anchor in Russia over the long term, and not just, because I think also we could also tie some threads also to Israel. But in large part, in terms of Russiagate, these influence operations tie directly to Russia. The second part, this mass consciousness operations, mass con-ops, tie very much into some of these Israeli networks, especially through people like Bannon and Breitbart, and then looking at Cambridge Analytica and things like Psy Group, Joel Zamel's group.
Joel Zamel, yes.
Inspiration is another Israeli group that was involved in these kind of social media psyops. So that's another part of this. This is being run through Facebook. A reminder again, Facebook was early on funded at a key moment when it sank in the market, as we pointed out, by Russian Gazprom money through Yuri Milner. So I don't think that's not a coincidence in many ways. And so Facebook is at the center of this. And then finally is election rigging, the actual that, and I would say that's the United States, and that's where you start getting into things like Code Red, the book by Jonathan Simon that I think is key in all of this. It points out how in the United States of America, the actual rigging, hardcore machine, like, material rigging of elections seems to run primarily through the right wing and through GOP networks, which is what we have to then go look back at 2016 and whether this was just sort of like the pollsters got it wrong and there was all these discontinuation between the exit polls and the actual results in key states, or whether this was just once again a follow-up to 2000 and 2004, which I would say also, if you think about 2000 election as surrounding the 9/11 operation, and not that it wouldn't have happened with Gore and Lieberman necessarily, but that yes, you really wanted Cheney and the hardcore right-wing neocons at the helm for your 9/11 operation. So I would just say we need to look at this actual context here in a three-part manner. And so, yes, if you're talking about election rigging, then we're talking about a very domestic thing. And I would say that's the military part of the operation. But if we're talking about things like influence operations, as Jimmy Dore is sort of just going blind on here in terms of Trump being cultivated as a long-term person of interest and target of Russian intelligence over decades, then you're talking about something like counterintelligence. And then finally, if you're talking about Breitbart and Cambridge Analytica and the SCL group and all of that psychographical, psychometric warfare that's still being unpacked, then you're talking about intelligence operations. So I just think that we need to sort of flesh out and have a conceptual framework to understand all the parts of what we're looking at, and just termed Russiagate and messing with the election.
Yeah, great breakdown there. And, you broke down just what was actually being dismissed by Jimmy Dore. Jimmy Dore has gone on to dismiss anything related to Michael Cohen or Paul Manafort. In particular, Michael Cohen is just all being about payments to adult film stars and Playboy cover girls, when I think that obviously, Michael Cohen and Paul Manafort are both up to their necks involved in all of these networks that you've been breaking down that Trump has been with basically his entire adult life, and that it's just extremely disingenuous to someone like Jimmy Dore, who I do not believe for one second is a stupid man or somebody who is incapable of understanding the significance of these connections. And so, then it continues on, the Soviet kind of network with these Soviet, Russian, Israeli networks with these very close tie-ins into the very elite financial communities in places like Manhattan, continued on with the Tafika Reefs and the Felix Saders doing business out of Trump Tower and Trump Soho and Manhattan property in the mid-2000s. So this has been ongoing, and this is much, much deeper than just, Russia's trying to rig our democracy. And I just have a hard time believing someone like Jimmy Dore is just so ignorant to these realities. But I know we're going to add some clips into the show description of Jimmy Dore basically deferring to Noam Chomsky on September 11th, saying that 9/11 truth is above his pay grade, and also a clip of Dore approvingly citing Chomsky and talking about Israel interfering in elections, which of course is a problem when this whole Russiagate narrative is so directly and so closely connected to a lot of the highest levels of the Israeli establishment, including Benjamin Netanyahu himself. And just like people like Oliver Stone and Chomsky himself have done, Jimmy Dore is now using Israel to dismiss Russian election collusion, which is just extremely, I think, missing the point. But I think Jeremy, if you don't have anything else to say about this, we're going to move on real quick to.
Yeah, I just wanted to say in terms of, you're right, that because now, just very recently, Dore has dismissed the Manafort guilty verdicts as just sort of having to do with just some random tax things that have nothing to do with Russian collusion. Meanwhile, there's going to be Manafort is facing another trial, one in which the Russia aspect will be in the mix, I believe. And it should be pointed out that some of this tax stuff is right in the background. And while Dore tries to wave it away as like, well, this was even before he was involved with Donald Trump. Some of this stuff happened right before he came in to help manage or to be the head manager of the Donald Trump campaign, and when he was millions and millions of dollars in debt to these key Russian Jewish oligarchs with tight connections to Putin, such as people like Deripaska. So that is obviously a part of this. If you're thinking about an influence operation, just as we read, like they're looking for your weaknesses in terms of whether it's your Manafort's desire to spend lots of money on ostrich jackets or that type of thing. This is an influence operation, so it very much has to do with so-called Russiagate. So that's right in the mix there. And so once again, Dore should have filled in the background when commenting on the Cohen and the Manafort stuff. Go back to the Steele dossier, but even more important, just look at what's on the direct record and look into people like Dmitry Firtash, who is the key oligarch who was helping Manafort in his Ukraine operation.
Yeah. And, I would just ask people that are, that kind of see this whole thing as they understand the evils of, the U.S. deep state, so to speak, and say Clinton types. Are these influence operations really any different than the ones that were done to basically compromise Bill Clinton and all of his friends and buddies in Arkansas? I mean, in their various vices. I mean, I don't really think it's that much different.
No, it's just even deeper and more worldwide in a certain way. And you mentioned Tawfiq Arif, which in some ways this collusion is right on the surface. And yes, not people in Donald Trump's circles. In terms of the actual connection between Russia and the United States in terms of the election has not yet been, people have not been found guilty exactly for that. Although you see the Flynn indictment is very much connects this whole thing. It's Russia. He's working with Russia behind the scenes. He's tasked to do that by Trump and Kushner, and it's also Israel is really front and center and all of that. And so we'll also link to an article about Tawfiq Arif, which is, you can find the picture of Trump with Tawfiq Arif and Felix Sater. This is right in Trump's wheelhouse, and we'll link to an article on trump-russia.com, who is Tawfiq Arif, and gets into his Soviet commerce background and wrestles with some of that, and then connects him with certain people like Michael Cherney. I don't know if it's Michael. Yeah, Michael Cherney. I'm just going to read briefly from this. Swiss authorities in 1996 accused Michael Cherney of drug trafficking, money laundering, fraud, and sponsoring murder on behalf of a Russian organized crime group run by Ivankov. This was the infamous Russian mob boss nicknamed Yaponchik, who had settled in New York, where the FBI found him hiding out in Trump Tower in Trump's New Jersey casino. Michael Cherney has repeatedly denied these allegations, which he blames on his arch-enemy and former partner Oleg Deripaska, one of the wealthiest men in Russia. In 2008, the federal Swiss court exonerated him of all of the charges, but 2 years later, Spain issued an international arrest warrant for Michael Cherney's arrest on money laundering charges. Did Arif have links to the Russian mafia? Felix Sater, who worked under Arif at Bayrock, seems to think so. And so just for all the leftists too, this is, look at what this is. This is like a imperial set too. This is all about, these are all people who are involved in metals and mining, and they're involved all throughout Asia and even some of them into Africa. So this is a looting operation too that the left, the sort of the anti-imperialist left, should really dig into.
Indeed, and I think that this would be a good time to, and this very much I think ties into what we just talked about with Jimmy Dore, and this I think provides another layer into this whole Russiagate narrative, and that is perhaps even the role of a lot of Russian state media, so to speak, such as Russia Today, and a lot of perhaps very questionable, likely less than honest operatives acting within these circles, within these various state-run media networks, such as not just RT in Russia, but also even perhaps something like tThis in Venezuela. And that is going to lead us into a clip of from Max Blumenthal's program Moderate Rebels, where he's introducing his guest, Abby Martin, my favorite person in the world, who, of course, at one point was a very outspoken advocate for 9/11 truth and is really regressed in a lot of ways. And I think this opening clip of Max Blumenthal, who's a leading poo-pooer of the Russiagate narrative, very much in the vein of a Jimmy Dore, and somebody who has taken shots at people who are truthers in his eyes, has been very, very critical of 9/11 truthers. This clip of him describing Alex Jones, I think, really is a very interesting one that I think is pretty enlightening in some ways.
Okay, here we go.
Moderate
Rebels. All right, welcome to Moderate Rebels. It's August 13th, 2018. I'm Max Blumenthal. Ben Norton is on hiatus, but he'll be back next week. Much needed rest from the cascading series of organically developed crises we're facing here, which we deflect onto Russia and external forces. We're here with Abby Martin, who is a friend of the show and has been really at the center of what we want to discuss today, which is a really concerted campaign to suppress dissident voices in online media. And it appears that this campaign is ramping up with a lot of government pressure on a very passive, willing partner in Silicon Valley. Abby, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me on, Max.
Good to have you here at this time, at this moment in history. One of our favorite people, Alex Jones, was just removed from several, pretty much all online platforms. It's actually not one of our favorite people. He's someone that you've been hammering for years, along with your brother, Robbie Martin, who does a really good job of exposing how Alex Jones took a lot of kind of skepticism around 9/11, like legitimate skepticism, where people were asking questions about the anthrax attacks, about the Saudi role, about blowback, and kind of moving people towards the right. And actually,
there you go.
Yeah, so if you're not talking about hijackers or anthrax or Saudi Arabia, then you're moving people to the right. I guess that's what all that science. Oh, that's right wing quack nonsense.
Yeah, things like gravity or the second law of thermodynamics. Those are right wing concepts.
Right. And this is troubling because, I'll send some links of Bloom. We could do a whole show on this topic, to be honest. Of course, we don't have time to, but, I'll send some links. I'll send the link to the article I wrote that got me banned from the 9/11 blogger website a couple of years ago. Max Blumenthal finds Abby Martin not guilty of 9/11 truth, and just Blumenthal's history of not only with 9/11, but with a lot of issues, particularly related to Palestine and Palestine Solidarity Movement, BDS movement, playing the role of like this policeman of discourse and trying to steer people away from getting too close to a lot of hard truths, I think, about the power of Zionism and Jewish power in general, not just in Israel, but here in the United States and globally in general. And so what I saw from this is this another layer, because these are two of the leading poo-pooing of the whole Russia collusion narrative. Is they're right there in the vein of Jimmy Dore as being among the most outspoken that are opposed to this. But in talking about the censorship of the Empire Files, Abby's program on tThis, which for the most part is a very, very well done documentary TV series. He's done a lot of great work on that show, notwithstanding some of my personal issues with some of the backtracking I think she's done on important issues. In discussing this and related to sanctions and economic and inability of money to come in from Venezuela, which has led to the inability to continue to make new episodes of this program, you brought up an important point when you were talking on False Flag Weekly News with Kevin Barrett about this, and that is that the influence of the state media in terms of Abby Martin and these people like Max Blumenthal that have really come around her in recent years, first at Russia Today and then at Telesur. And I pointed out to you when we were talking that it was RT that put Abby kind of on the map to a bigger community than just like the kind of the 9/11 circles that she was running in, although Abby won't admit it now. Her and Alex Jones were actually very much they did work together at one point on a lot of things. And but it was RT that put her Occupy Oakland work on the map. And then, she was brought on first as I think a contributor, and she got her own program on RT. And then you start to see these Max Blumenthals. And also, in addition to, I think, having a negative effect on her ability to really discuss a lot of deep truths, I think it also moved her into this dialectic of this Marxist Bolshevik worldview, which I think is just the other side of the dialectic to this kind of this Zionist, nationalist,
capitalist,
right wing. Yeah, exactly. And I think in the process of that this has kind of been a 2 or 3-fold operation, and you describe it as the carrot and the stick, moving someone like her away from a lot of these more controversial, I think, harder or real deep truths, such as the events such as September 11th and the actual extent of the operation, and also moving into this more of for all Abby's flaws when she was in this Alex Jones InfoWars We Are Change spear, I think she had more of an understanding of just the falseness of this of this system in general and a lot of the false systems that are out there, but now has moved so hardcore into this leftist direction. And we've described this as possibly being part of perhaps a Soviet, to an extent, splinter operation, which is just designed to control a lot of the more harder elements as far as like the right wing and left wing movements in this country are concerned. But I just see this as being a 3-fold operation. You can see someone like Max Blumenthal, his history of ridiculing 9/11 truthers, being at the forefront of an operation to move people like Abby Martin away. And I would also compare and contrast her with Caitlin Johnstone, who very much is also another leading figure in this whole poo-pooing of Russiagate. And much like how, Max Blumenthal is very overtly, and other people, maybe answer coalition types that are really into the Bolshevik side of the dialectic, have steered Abby, have really come around her. Now you've also have a Caitlin Johnstone, less overtly, more maybe covertly. It's people like Mike Cernovich and Jack Posobiec, who are very much pushing the same narrative on Russiagate from a right-wing perspective, have really become insulated themselves into Caitlin Johnstone's inner circle, so to speak. So I pointed that out as well. But I think this is important as a means of showing just how it's the same people that come around on Russiagate and the harder truths about September 11th, and just where all of these people fall short is that you get even someone like an Abby Martin, who was outspoken at one point about I think a lot of the deeper aspects of September 11th, is now just completely gone backwards on that, and is also to the point to where she can't see, or perhaps intentionally or unintentionally, is not able to see a bigger picture at play with something like Russiagate and the actual ramifications of it.
Yes, and I do think it's key to look at that idea of the state sponsorship. You can have the problem of corporate sponsorship, but you can also have the problem of state sponsorship potentially. And I would repeat what I said on False Flag Weekly News, is that I do think that Abby Martin does some of the most important left journalism out there, especially in relationship to going on the ground and getting stories out of places like Palestine, Venezuela, for example, where very few other people are actually getting audio, visual
I would even
documentation.
Add Houston, Texas, after the hurricanes last year, and getting some of the stories of the people on the ground there that are just being stereotyped as just looters and criminals. So that's all great work, and I commend most of the work she does to this day. So
yeah, and at the same time, as she then gets taken into state media like RT, for example, and now we know some of the deeper background behind RT and the issues of 9/11 being basically the red line on RT, the Israeli satellites and all of that. And then I think there's also this aspect of being dependent in a certain way, whether it's being dependent on Telesur or being dependent on certain social, professional networks in terms of what it means to be, quote, legitimate in Max Blumenthal's, creating the red line about what's legitimate questioning about September 11th. And you're only also allowed to question. You're not actually allowed to do a productive analysis that makes assertions based on open source facts and things like physical observations. No, you're only allowed to ask questions about things like Saudi hijackers, blowback, anthrax in some nebulous way. But meanwhile, there's actually, let's actually sort of go down that route. It's interesting he didn't include Israel, even in relationship to things like blowback or even in relationship to things like hijackers. And so there's an article that put out by Wayne Madsen that was then leaked via WikiLeaks in their big Stratfor
We've got about 2 minutes left, so anyway, go ahead.
So this is Mossad ran 9/11 Arab, quote, hijacker, unquote, terrorist operation. And this was just sent into Stratfor by a guy, and then it got leaked by WikiLeaks in their dump of the Stratfor documents by Wayne Madsen. British intelligence reported in February 2002 that the Israeli Mossad ran the Arab hijacker cells that were later blamed by the U.S. government's 9/11 Commission for carrying out the aerial attacks on the World Trade Center and Pentagon. Wayne Madsen report has received details of the British intelligence report, which was suppressed by the government of then Prime Minister Tony Blair. A Mossad unit consisting of 6 Egyptian and Yemeni-born Jews infiltrated, quote, al-Qaeda, unquote, cells in Hamburg, the Atta Mamun Darkanzali cell, South Florida, and Sharjah in the United Arab Emirates in the months before 9/11. The Mossad not only infiltrated cells, but began to run them and give them specific orders that would eventually culminate in their being on board 4 regularly scheduled flights originating in Boston, Washington, Dulles, and Newark, New Jersey on 9/11. The Mossad infiltration team comprised 6 Israelis, comprising 2 cells of 3 agents who all received special training at a Mossad base in the Negev desert in their future control and handling of the, quote, unquote, al-Qaeda cells. One Mossad cell traveled to Amsterdam, where they submitted to the operational control of the Mossad's Europe station, which operates from the El Al complex at Schiphol International Airport. The 3-man Mossad unit then traveled to Hamburg, where it made contact with Mohammed Atta, who believed they were sent by Osama bin Laden. In fact, they were sent by Ephraim Halevi, the chief of Mossad. And by the way, the key friend of one James Jesus Angleton at the core of the Kennedy assassination, too, apparently. And then the last couple paragraphs, and then we'll end up. The second 3-man Mossad team flew to New York and then to southern Florida, where they began to direct the, quote, al-Qaeda, unquote, cells operating from in Hollywood, Miami, Vero Beach, Delray Beach, and West Palm Beach. Israeli, quote, unquote, art students already under investigation by the DEA for casing the offices and homes of federal law enforcement officers have been living among and conducting surveillance of the activities, including flight school training of the future Arab, quote, hijacker, unquote, cells, particularly in Hollywood and Vero Beach. In August 01, the first Mossad team flew with Atta and other Hamburg, quote, unquote, al-Qaeda members to Boston. Logan International Airport Security was contracted to Huntley USA, a firm owned by an Israeli airport security firm closely connected to Mossad, international consultants on targeted security. ICTS's owners were politically connected to the Likud party, particularly the Netanyahu faction, and then Jerusalem mayor and future Prime Minister Ehud Olmert. It was Olmert who personally interceded with New York Mayor Rudolph Giuliani to have released from prison 5 urban moving systems employees identified by the CIA and FBI agents as Mossad agents. The Israelis were the only suspects arrested anywhere in the United States on 9/11 who were thought to have been involved in the 9/11 attacks. So until next week, thanks Donald Trump for pointing out all of the Muslims celebrating 9/11. We out.
Thank you. Until next time. Goodbye.